science. Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission here, well, it's pretty simple. To give you the comprehensive synthesized knowledge you need to be really well informed without you having to sift through just endless scientific literature yourself.
Yeah, it's about cutting through the noise. Exactly. And today we're doing a critical deep dive into a core challenge in modern ecology, trying to predict the ecological damage caused by non-native species. It's a huge issue.
It really is. Our main guide for this exploration is a very influential 2013 review paper. It's called Progress Toward Understanding the Ecological Impacts of Non-Native Species. And the lead author is Anthony Ricciardi.
A landmark paper in the field for sure.
Definitely. And this isn't just a summary, It feels more like a necessary blueprint for figuring out which newly arrived species actually pose the biggest threats to ecosystems globally.
Right. We're trying to move beyond just asking if a species will establish.
Yeah, that's sort of the first hurdle.
To the much harder question, really, of how much damage it's going to inflict down the line.
Okay, let's unpack this crucial paper.
So the whole premise of the paper, it's really driven by this sense of urgency. Human activity, global trade, travel, all the environmental disturbance, it's moving species around faster and further than ever before in history.
It's unprecedented, isn't it?
Completely. And this speed is causing just massive, sometimes irreversible ecological shifts. Now, the field of invasion ecology, it's actually gotten pretty good at explaining establishment and spread, what we often call invasiveness.
Okay, so predicting if it'll show up and spread out.
Exactly. But our ability to accurately forecast when and where a non-native species is going to cause really strong, measurable ecological impacts, that ability remains, well, surprisingly weak.
And that gap, that inability to predict the impact, it's not just some academic puzzle, is it?
Oh, definitely not.
It affects everything, how we prioritize, limited conservation money, which species we actually focus management efforts on.
Absolutely. If you can't predict the impact reasonably well, you can't really manage the risk effectively. You're just guessing.
Makes sense.
And that lack of predictability, that's exactly what the Ricciardi paper tackles head on. Their main goal was to try and consolidate this often fragmented field of invasion ecology.
How did they go about doing that?
Well, they synthesized and reviewed 19 specific testable hypotheses. These are all mechanistic ideas trying to explain why impacts vary so much over time and space.
19 hypotheses, that's quite a few.
It is. The hope was, and still is, to push the field towards a more unified theoretical framework, one that allows for general predictions, not just site-specific ones.
Okay, so finding the general rules, not just the exceptions.
Precisely.
So before diving into those 19 hypotheses, the paper first needed to define what impact even means in this context.
Yeah, that's critical. They define ecological impact very strictly. It's a measurable change to the properties of an ecosystem by non-native species.
A measurable change. That sounds simple, but I guess the implications are pretty big.
They are huge because first, it immediately shifts the discussion away from human judgment or perception. We're not automatically talking about economic costs or whether we think a species is a pest.
Right, it's about the ecology itself.
Exactly. It's about quantifiable effects. And this approach ensures two things. One, it means basically every non-native species that integrates into a system has some impact. It's a spectrum, could be positive, could be negative, varying in size.
Okay, so no species is truly neutral once it's established.
Pretty much. And second, by making it measurable, you can actually compare impacts rigorously across different places, different times, different types of species.
How do they make it measurable? Is there a standard way? Well, they adopt this integrative metric that Parker and colleagues proposed back in 1999. It gives us a sort of formula for overall ecological impact. Y dollies equals R times A times E. Okay, I equals R times A times E. Let's break that down.
Yeah, this equation is really fundamental to the whole paper. So R is the range, basically, the total area the non-native species occupies.
How widespread it is.
Right. Then A is the abundance, how many individuals there are, or their biomass per unit area. Think density.
Okay, range and abundance. That sounds like the traditional way we measure invasion success.
It is. Those two, R and A, are the classic measures of how successful a species is at colonizing and spreading. That's been the main focus of invasion biology for a long time.
But there's a third letter, E.
Yes, E. This is where the paper argues we really need to shift our focus for better prediction. E stands for the per capita effect.
Per capita, so the effect to individual.
Exactly. It's the specific functional effect of a single organism on whatever ecosystem property you're measuring. So for a filter feeding mussel, E might be its filtration rate, or maybe how it changes the structure of the lake bottom.
Got it. So it's not just how many there are, A, or where they are, but what each one actually does, E.
Precisely. And the paper's core argument is that while invasion theory has historically focused on RNA, understanding and predicting impact really hinges on explaining the variation in E.
That leads to something you mentioned earlier, this disconnect between success and impact. It just feels wrong somehow. You'd automatically assume that the species that spreads fastest and gets super abundant high RNA must be the worst
It
one.
feels intuitive, right? But the paper really hammers home this success-impact disconnect. The evidence shows the correlation between invasion success, RNA, and the actual magnitude of impact, I, is often surprisingly weak. Sometimes it's just not there at all.
So you can have super successful invaders that don't cause much trouble.
Absolutely. You get species that are incredible colonizers. They spread far and wide, achieve really high numbers, so they have high R and high A. But their per capita effect, their E, is pretty minor, so the overall impact I stays low.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. Think about the freshwater jellyfish, Crassbedicus sourby. It's found pretty much globally, and sometimes it forms these really dense blooms. So high R, sometimes high A. But fundamentally, it doesn't seem to disrupt the whole ecosystem's energy flow or nutrient cycles in a major way.
Never thought about jellyfish impact much.
Or think about the common dandelion Taraxacum officinale. It's literally everywhere, right? Very high R. Yet, compared to some other invasive plants, it doesn't cause massive ecological disruption on the same scale.
Okay, that makes sense. And then the flip side must be true too. Species that aren't super widespread but cause havoc where they do exist.
Exactly. That's the high E problem. These are species with a really strong per capita effect, but maybe their range or abundance A is limited. They're like ecological bombs, devastating, but maybe only in a localized area.
Examples.
Well, the paper mentions species like the Asian clam, Potamocorbula amurensis in parts of San Francisco Bay, for instance, or even escaped Atlantic salmon, Samo salar, in certain rivers where they aren't native. Their overall numbers might not be huge system-wide, but their per capita effect, whether it's filtering the entire water column or outcompeting native fish, is locally devastating.
So this really forces us to think differently about management. We need to separate managing invasiveness, the spread, from managing impact, the damage, per individual.
That's the key takeaway. They're related, but not the same problem.
Okay, so impact isn't just about success. What else makes predicting it so tricky? Well, two big things compound the complexity: how rare major impacts are and how much they vary. The paper points out that ecological impacts tend to follow an inverse magnitude frequency relationship. Inverse magnitude frequency, like earthquakes, where the huge magnitude 9 ones are super rare, but little tremors happen all the time.
Exactly like that. It's a similar statistical pattern. The vast majority of non-native species that establish probably cause negligible or, manageable impacts, background noise almost.
But then you get the ecological big ones.
Right. The handful of truly catastrophic events, think Nile perch wiping out cichlids in Lake Victoria, or zebra mussels transforming the Great Lakes, those are the rare high-magnitude events. This actually explains why, even though non-native species are a leading cause of animal extinctions globally, only a relatively small fraction of all invasions actually cause those extinctions. The really big impacts are outliers.
And even for a single species, its impact isn't fixed, right? It can change depending on where it is and when.
Absolutely. That's the core idea of context dependency. The impact of the very same non-native species can vary hugely from one site to another, and it can also change dramatically over time at the same site.
How does that work spatially? What makes the impact different in different places?
Spatially, it's all about the local environment, both the biotic parts, like the existing community structure, and the abiotic parts, like temperature, nutrients, light availability. These local factors dictate how well the invader performs.
So its performance changes its per capita effect, the E value.
Precisely. Its E value goes up or down depending on the local context. A plant might need specific pollinators. If they're present, its impact could be huge. If they're absent, its impact might be zero, even if the plant itself survives.
And what about the temporal variation? Does impact just build up steadily over time?
Not usually that simple. Often impacts accrue really quickly at first, maybe during the exponential growth phase of the invasion. Then they might level off.
Okay, that makes sense.
But interestingly, sometimes the impact actually attenuates in the long run. Maybe native species adapt or evolve some resistance, or the invader depletes a key resource.
So it can get better over time.
It can. But the really tricky temporal pattern, the one that makes prediction hard, is the long lag time. We see cases where a species establishes, hangs around at low levels, maybe for decades,
Decades.
sometimes up to a century, according to the paper, and then suddenly its population explodes or its impact becomes catastrophic. There's this long fuse before the ecological bomb goes off.
100-year fuse. What causes that?
It could be a few things. Maybe it's a slow, cumulative wearing down of the ecosystem's resistance, or, importantly, it could be an adaptation by the invader itself. Perhaps some genetic evolution happens, or maybe a crucial partner like a specific fungus or pollinator gets introduced later.
So it needed a buddy to really take off.
Could be. Or it might just be that the external environment changes. Maybe climate change finally creates the perfect conditions, or some other disturbance happens that allows the invader's its per capita effect, to finally reach its full damaging potential. That change in the environment, it brings us right to this really tough problem, the driver versus passenger dilemma. Ugh, yes, this is a nightmare for analysis. When we see ecological change happening alongside an invasion, is the non-native species the driver actually causing the change? Or is it just a passenger, basically taking advantage of changes that were already happening because of other human stressors?
Like climate change, pollution, habitat destruction.
Exactly, because invasions rarely happen in perfectly pristine environments, right? They're almost always interacting with these other stressors. Imagine a wetland that's already getting hammered by nutrient runoff from farms. Then an invasive plant takes hold. How much of the subsequent native plant loss is due to the invader directly competing versus the underlying pollution that weakened the natives anyway?
It's hard to tease apart. And sometimes it's probably both, feeding into each other.
Oh, absolutely. It's often a feedback loop. Take some of the non-native grasses spreading into tropical forests. Their initial success might be driven by climate change, shifting temperature zones, or maybe higher CO2 levels, so they start as passengers.
Okay, riding the wave of environmental change.
But once they establish, these grasses often increase fire frequency dramatically. They convert forest to grassland. That changes everything: carbon storage, water cycles. So they shift from being passengers to being incredibly active ecosystem-altering drivers.
Wow, and that shift can happen pretty quickly.
Within a human lifetime, easily. So, okay, before we finally get to the specific hypotheses, there's one more layer of complexity: indirect effects.
Yes.
Direct effects, like predation or competition for the exact same resource, are sometimes easier to predict, but often the really big community-wide or ecosystem-level impacts come from subtle, cascading indirect effects, and these can lead to really counterintuitive outcomes.
Counterintuitive how? Can you give an example from the paper? Well, think about biological control efforts. Sometimes people introduce a non-native insect to try and control an invasive weed. The goal is direct. Insect eats weed, problem solved. Makes sense.
But sometimes that introduced insect doesn't just eat the target weed. Maybe it starts eating nearby native plants too. Or even weirder, sometimes its presence can actually worsen the weed's negative impact on the native community through some indirect pathway.
Wait, how can eating the weed make things worse?
Maybe by changing the weed's chemistry or altering soil microbes or interacting with native predators in unexpected ways. The point is, these secondary interactions can unintentionally magnify the problem, even if the biocontrol agent is successfully reducing the target weed's population. It gets complicated fast.
Okay, clearly this is complex. So how do we start making predictions? You said the Ricciardi paper groups the 19 hypotheses into categories.
Yeah, they put them into 6 conceptual groups. Let's start with the first group, which looks at the traits of the invader itself and the structure of the community it's entering, especially trophic dynamics, who eats whom.
All right, so basic characteristics first.
Right. The species traits hypothesis is pretty straightforward. It suggests that high-impact invaders often share certain traits. Things like really high reproductive rates, fecundity, being able to grab resources super fast, like high predation rates, or just really rapid growth, maybe having a larger body size compared to similar native species, or being particularly aggressive.
Traits that give them an edge in performance.
Exactly. These traits tend to boost their per capita effect, that ease value.
And then there are traits of the environment itself that make it more vulnerable.
Yes, the
Yeah.
ecosystem traits. Some systems are just inherently more fragile or susceptible to disruption by any strong invader. These often include places with really high natural productivity or environments that experience frequent physical disturbances like floods or fires. And the classic example is insular systems islands, isolated lakes. They often have unique species assemblages that are evolutionarily naive and just haven't evolved defenses against certain types of competitors or predators. These traits make the whole system more prone to collapse when something novel with a high E arrives.
Now, moving into the community structure, the classic idea is the trophic position hypothesis, right? Going back to Charles Elton in the 50s, the idea that top predators should cause the most disruption.
That's the traditional view, and honestly, the most dramatic poster child examples of invasions really support it. Non-native predators are responsible for a huge proportion of animal extinctions caused by invasions.
Like the brown tree snake in Guam.
Exactly. Wiped out almost all the native forest birds, reptiles, bats. Or the Nile perch introduced into Lake Victoria, a top predator that just decimated hundreds of unique endemic cichlid fish species through sheer predation.
Those are horrifying examples. They definitely shape how we think about invasive predators. But you said earlier that some broader studies find that trophic position alone isn't always a great predictor of overall community impact.
How does that square?
It's a bit of a contradiction, yeah. I think part of it is just the complexity of real food webs versus simple categories. First, many successful invaders aren't neat top predators or herbivores. They're often generalist omnivores, eating lots of different things. Their role can be really complex and context-dependent.
Okay, so neat labels don't always fit.
Right. And second, while a top predator might cause high extinction rates for specific prey species, which is obviously a massive impact, it might not necessarily cause the same kind of widespread restructuring of the entire community's function compared to, say, an invasive plant that changes nutrient cycles or an ecosystem engineer. The predator's impact might be more acute and targeted rather than diffuse.
Okay. Let's look at other food web mechanisms. What about the uncontrolled consumer enemy release hypothesis? This one's really about competitive advantage gained through the food web. The prediction is that the biggest impacts often come from generalist consumers, herbivores, or predators that aren't effectively controlled by enemies in their new range. Either native predators don't eat them, or they've left their specialist enemies behind.
And that links to enemy release.
Yes, the enemy release idea is a key part of it. It suggests that when non-native species arrive, they escape their co-evolved specialist predators, parasites, and diseases from their native range. This freedom from enemies allows them to potentially reallocate resources. Instead of spending energy on defense like making toxins or tough shells, they can put that energy into growing faster and reproducing more.
That's the IICA idea, evolution of increased competitive ability.
That's one potential outcome, yes. They might evolve to be more competitive over time because they're freed from that defensive burden.
But again, you mentioned the evidence linking enemy release directly to impact is kind of mixed.
It is. If you do big biogeographic comparisons, count the number of enemy species in the native range versus the new range. Yeah, non-natives generally do have fewer specialist enemies in the new place. Enemy release seems real in that sense.
Okay.
But when you look at local community studies, how are these non-natives actually interacting within the new food web? You often find they're getting hammered by local generalist predators and parasites, maybe just as much as native species are.
So they might escape their old enemies but pick up new ones.
Or the generalists just add them to the menu. So while they might gain some resource allocation advantage, it doesn't always translate into a massive ecosystem impact. The predictive link isn't as clear-cut as we might hope.
Okay. Now, the opposite idea is the biotic resistance hypothesis, the theory that really diverse, complex communities should be harder to invade and less likely to suffer big impacts.
Right.
The thinking is more species means more filled niches, more competitors, more predators, just a tougher environment for a newcomer to gain a foothold and cause trouble. Does that hold up?
It's a really common idea, especially when talking about establishment success. But its value for predicting impact is, again, a bit uncertain. Diversity can provide some buffering, definitely, but often other factors seem more important for preventing major impact. Things like abiotic conditions. Is the place even suitable for the invader? Or is there maybe just one really effective native predator or competitor present? That might matter more than overall species richness.
And sometimes the existing community can actually make the invader's impact worse, indirectly, through something called apparent competition.
Yes, this is a really important and often overlooked indirect pathway that can lead to high impact. Apparent competition happens when a non-native species comes in. Maybe it becomes moderately abundant, but it doesn't directly compete much with native species for food or space.
Okay, so it's not fighting them head-to-head.
Right. But it serves as an extra food source, a prey subsidy for a native generalist predator. That predator population booms because it has more food available.
Ah, so the native predator gets a boost from the invader.
Exactly. And this larger, healthier native predator population then increases its overall hunting pressure on all its prey, including the original native prey species.
So the native prey end up getting hit harder by their own predator, thanks to the invader providing extra food.
Precisely. The negative impact on the native prey community is magnified, potentially way beyond what the invader's direct competition would ever have caused. It highlights why just looking at resource overlap isn't enough. You have to consider these complex food web links and subsidies.
Okay, that's a whole different level of complexity. Let's shift gears now to the second group of hypotheses. These seem to focus more directly on that ease factor. The functional difference is the novelty. It's this tension between niche replacement and novelty.
Exactly. So one model is niche replacement or limiting similarity. If a non-native species comes in and it occupies basically the same niche as a native species, eats the same food, uses the same space, but it's just a superior competitor.
It wins the direct fight.
Right. It should cause high direct impact by competitively excluding the native species from that shared niche. It's straightforward head-to-head replacement.
But you're saying the really profound system-changing impacts often come from invaders that are different, from novelty.
That's what a lot of the evidence points to. This is covered by hypotheses like novel resource use or trait distinctiveness. The idea is that non-natives that use key resources or interact with the environment in ways that are fundamentally different from any native species are much more likely to cause strong indirect impacts. They don't just compete within the existing rules, they change the rules of the game.
Like the example you gave earlier of nitrogen-fixing plants in places like Hawaii.
That's a perfect example. Those ecosystems evolved under low nitrogen conditions without native nitrogen fixers.
Right.
When non-native legumes arrive, they pump nitrogen into the soil, dramatically changing the nutrient availability.
Which benefits other invaders maybe, but hurts the natives adapted to low nitrogen.
Exactly. It triggers this cascade of change throughout the whole community structure. The invader didn't necessarily outcompete natives for light or water directly. It altered the fundamental chemistry of the system in a novel way.
This idea of novelty seems central. It connects to the novel weapons hypothesis too, right? Invaders bringing unique biochemical tricks or defenses.
Yeah, novel weapons are a powerful mechanism. It's where the invader possesses some biochemical, physical, or even behavioral trait that the native community simply hasn't evolved any defense against.
Like chemical warfare from plants.
That's the most studied example. Think about allelopathy. Certain invasive plants, like Centaurea knapweeds, release chemicals into the soil. These chemicals can directly harm native plants, but maybe more insidiously, they can disrupt the beneficial relationships native plants have with soil microbes, like mycorrhizal fungi.
So they sabotage the native plant support system underground.
Right, it reduces the native plant's ability to get nutrients, making it less competitive. And sometimes, those same chemicals might even make nutrients more available to the invader itself. It's a really effective novel strategy.
And it's not just plants. You mentioned cane toads earlier.
Yep. The toxins produced by cane toads, when they were introduced to Australia, acted as a novel weapon against native predators, snakes, lizards, quolls that tried to eat them. These predators had no evolutionary experience with that type of toxin, leading to massive die-offs.
Okay, so novel resource use, novel weapons. What's the third big novelty type? Ecosystem engineering.
Right. Engineers are species that fundamentally change the physical environment. They create or modify habitat in ways that are unique to that system.
Like the zebra mussel example.
Classic example. Zebra mussels form these incredibly dense colonies called druses. These clumps of shells physically change the lake bottom, altering water flow, sediment patterns, and creating complex structures where none existed before. This favors some species, harms others.
And they filter the water like crazy too, right?
Yeah, massively. They dramatically increase water clarity, which changes light penetration, affects phytoplankton growth, and fundamentally alters the lake's energy pathways. They re-engineer the whole aquatic environment.
And you mentioned earlier that this engineering makes restoration really hard.
Extremely hard. Because even if you could magically remove all the zebra mussels, the changes they made persist. You still have the shell layers, the altered water clarity, the changed nutrient cycling, the physical and chemical stage has been reset, and the original native community might not be able to thrive there anymore, even without the engineer present. Restoration becomes much more than just removing the invader.
All this focus on novelty really hinges on the idea that the receiving community is somehow unprepared or
Yeah.
evolutionarily naive.
Exactly. Naivete is the flip side of novelty. If the native community has no evolutionary history with organisms that function like the invader, the impact is likely to be much higher. We saw this with zebra mussels, again, their impact on North American freshwater mussels, which evolved without similar biofouling species, was catastrophic. They were smothered.
Whereas European mussels had some history with them.
Right. They'd coexisted before the ice ages, apparently, so they had some level of adaptation or resistance. The impact was much less severe when zebra mussels were reintroduced there. Pathogens are another stark example, like the crayfish plague fungus from North America, devastating European crayfish that had zero resistance.
So if this evolutionary mismatch, this novelty or naivete is so important, how can we try to measure or predict that risk ahead of time? You mentioned phylogenetic distinctiveness.
Yeah, this is a really clever approach to try and quantify novelty. Phylogenetic distinctiveness basically measures how distantly related the invader is to the species already present in the native community. Are they from the same genus, the same family, or a completely different order?
And the idea is the more distantly related, the more likely they are to be functionally novel.
That's the concept, and there's pretty good empirical support for it. Studies have shown that non-native species belonging to novel genera, meaning they don't have any close relatives in the native community, do tend to have stronger average impacts. It's not a perfect predictor, but that phylogenetic distance acts as a useful, measurable proxy for ecological novelty and the potential for high impact.
Interesting. Okay, and finally in this group, we circle back briefly to AICA, the evolution of increased competitive ability. This feels like a mechanism that drives those lag times we talked about.
It could definitely contribute to lag times. The hypothesis, remember, is that escaping enemies allows the invader to reallocate resources from defense to growth and reproduction over evolutionary time. This gradual increase in competitive ability could slowly ramp up its per capita effect, leading to impacts that only become apparent much later.
But the evidence is still mixed, especially for animals.
Yeah, the empirical support is patchy, and there's a significant taxonomic bias. Most of the work testing EACA has been done on plants. We really don't know how generally it applies to animal invaders, which is a big knowledge gap.
Okay, let's move to the next set of hypotheses. These seem to focus more on the abiotic environment and the sheer volume of introductions, the context and the influx.
Right. So how does the physical environment mediate impact? One idea is environmental heterogeneity.
Meaning how patchy or varied the environment is.
Exactly. If the environment varies a lot spatially or temporally, it can actually create little pockets or refugio where conditions aren't great for the invader but are okay for native species.
So patchiness helps the natives hang on.
It can. It allows for coexistence and can mitigate the invader's overall impact. Conversely, if you have a really dominant invader in a very homogeneous environment, its impact is likely to be maximal because there's nowhere for the natives to escape that intense competitive pressure.
That ties into environmental matching or habitat filtering, right? The idea that impact is strongest where the conditions are just right for the invader.
Precisely. Impact peaks where the local environmental conditions, temperature, salinity, whatever, closely match the invader's physiological optimum. That's where it performs best, achieves its maximum per capita effect, and therefore has the strongest impact. This is key to explaining why the same invader can be devastating in one river system but totally benign in the next one over. It's all about that physiological match.
And then you have situations where the environment itself is changing, either through disturbance or directional change, like climate warming. How does that play in?
This is where things can really get amplified. Disturbance like a fire, flood, or even just clearing land removes the existing residents, frees up resources, and lowers that biotic resistance we talked about. Directional change, like a gradual warming trend, might make the environment less suitable for natives while simultaneously becoming more suitable for an invader adapted to warmer conditions.
So both scenarios basically open the door wider for invaders.
They fling it open and roll out the red carpet, and this can lead to really extreme positive feedback loops. The classic, terrifying example is cheatgrass, Bromus tectorum, in the Intermountain West of North America.
How does cheatgrass create a feedback loop? What does it do?
Cheatgrass establishes easily, and it produces this dense, fine, highly flammable layer of dead grass each year. This fundamentally changes the fire regime. Natural fires in those sagebrush ecosystems might have occurred every 60 to 100 years. Cheatgrass creates conditions where fires now happen every 3 to 5 years.
Wow, that's a massive shift.
Huge. And the native shrubs and perennial grasses can't handle that frequent fire. They get wiped out. But cheatgrass, being an annual, thrives on frequent fire. It comes back even stronger the next year. So the invader modifies the environment, the disturbance regime, in a way that guarantees its own dominance and prevents the natives from returning. It's a complete ecosystem conversion driven by this feedback.
Okay, that's sobering. Now let's talk about the numbers, the influx hypotheses.
Yeah.
We often hear about propagules pressure. That's just the number of individuals introduced, right? How does that impact E, not just establishment RNA?
Propagules pressure, the number of individuals introduced, and how often they're introduced definitely boosts the chances of establishment and can lead to faster population growth, increasing RNA. But the link to E, the per capita effect, is really important and maybe less intuitive.
How does it connect?
High influx doesn't just mean more individuals, it often means a greater diversity of genotypes being introduced. You're essentially sampling more of the invader's genetic variation from its native range.
Ah, more genetic raw material.
Exactly. This genetic richness increases the odds that some individuals with particularly high E, maybe they're more virulent, more competitive, better adapted to the new conditions, will be present in the introduced group. It also provides the fuel for rapid evolution or potentially hybridization after establishment. This evolutionary boost can significantly increase the average per capita effect E of the population over time.
So high propagules pressure isn't just about getting enough bodies on the ground. It's about bringing in the genetic lottery tickets for potentially higher impact later on.
That's a great way to put it. And we can contrast that with colonization pressure. This is slightly different. It refers to the number of different non-native species, subspecies, or distinct genetic lineages being released into an area.
So not just more individuals of one species, but more types of potential invaders.
Right. This is more about a sampling effect at a higher taxonomic level. The more different kinds of non-native organisms you introduce to a region, the higher the probability, just by sheer chance, that one of them will turn out to be a high-impact, harmful species. It's like buying more lottery tickets from different games. Eventually, you're more likely to hit a bad jackpot.
Got it. Okay, final group of hypotheses. These deal with invaders helping each other out. The invasional meltdown biotic facilitation idea sounds ominous.
It does paint a grim picture. The meltdown hypothesis predicts that established non-native species can actually facilitate the invasion and impact of other non-native species. This can lead to this accelerating accumulation of invaders and, crucially, to synergistic impacts.
Synergistic meaning the combined effect is worse than just adding up their individual effects.
Exactly. 1 + 1 = 3, ecologically speaking. The idea is that the ecosystem becomes progressively less resistant and more easily invaded once the first few non-natives get established and start interacting.
How does that facilitation actually work? What do they do for each other?
It can happen in lots of ways. Maybe non-native plants change the soil in a way that favors other non-native plants, or maybe you get non-native mutualisms forming, like a non-native plant and its specific non-native pollinator arriving together. The paper mentions examples like in Australia, where introduced European rabbits became super abundant. They then served as a massive food subsidy for the introduced European red fox. This allowed fox populations to boom far beyond what the native prey could have supported. The result: much higher fox predation pressure, including surplus killing on vulnerable native mammals.
So the rabbit essentially fueled the fox's impact on natives. Neither one alone would have been as bad.
Precisely. It was their combined synergistic effect that really drove the decline of some native species. Another example they mention is from the Great Lakes, involving those draconid mussels again and the non-native round goby fish.
What do they do together?
There's evidence suggesting their combined activities, the mussels filtering and concentrating things from the water column, and the guppies eating the mussels, might create a pathway that biomagnifies certain environmental toxins, like botulinum toxin. This potentially leads to the large-scale outbreaks of avian botulism that periodically kill thousands of water birds in the Great Lakes. It's a complex interaction involving multiple non-natives.
Wow. Okay, so bringing all 19 of these hypotheses together, what was the final synthesis? Ricciardi and colleagues looked at all this evidence. Which factors did they conclude have the strongest, broadest support for predicting impact?
They boiled it down to 4 key determinants that seem most consistently important across different species and ecosystems. These should probably form the core of any general theory of impact.
All right, what are the big four?
First, the evolutionary experience of the recipient community, basically, that ecological naivete factor. How prepared is the native community for this type of organism?
Okay, novelty and naivete. Makes sense.
Second, the degree of environmental constraint. How much does the local environment limit the invader's abundance and performance? This ties back to that environmental matching idea. Is the habitat optimal for the invader or not?
So suitability of the environment. Got it.
Third, organismal influx, particularly propagal pressure. The sheer number and genetic diversity of individuals arriving influences not just establishment, but the potential magnitude and scope of impact later on.
The numbers and the genetics matter. And the fourth.
Fourth is the presence of novel traits in the invader. Things like novel weapons, unique ways of using resources, or distinct ecosystem engineering effects. And remember, phylogenetic distinctiveness can often serve as a good proxy for this functional novelty.
So evolutionary history, environmental match, influx numbers, and functional difference. Those are the pillars.
That seems to be where the strongest, most general evidence lies. These four elements move us way beyond just correlating establishment success with impact.
They provide a much richer picture. But the author still pointed out limitations, right? It's not like we have perfect prediction now.
Oh, absolutely not. They were very clear about the ongoing challenges. A huge one is still the lack of good pre-invasion baseline data for many ecosystems. It's incredibly hard to measure the change if you don't know exactly what it was like before the invader arrived.
Right, you need that starting point.
And there's still significant taxonomic bias in how these hypotheses have been tested. We mentioned EIC being mostly studied in plants. We need more rigorous comparative studies using meta-analyses, maybe controlled experiments in mesocosms, computer simulations to really test how general these ideas are across animals, fungi, microbes, everything.
And that big analytical challenge remains separating invasion effects from everything else humans are doing to the planet.
Yeah. That persistent difficulty in truly distinguishing invasion-mediated effects from all the other co-occurring stressors, climate change, pollution, habitat loss, that's probably still the single biggest hurdle to clear prediction. Future research really needs to develop better ways, maybe more hypotheses specifically focused on predicting indirect effects, because those are so often the game changers.
So the core challenge hasn't entirely disappeared. It still comes back to understanding the factors that control variation in that per capita effect.
That's the crux of it. We need to get better at predicting what an individual organism will do functionally in a new context.
So the ultimate takeaway then, for you listening, is that managing invasive species effectively maybe isn't just about building better border controls, focusing only on the RNA factors, establishment and spread.
Right, that's part of it, but maybe not the whole story for predicting harm.
It seems to be more about understanding these really complex functional relationships, predicting how a species is likely to interact with and change the workings, the architecture of the ecosystem it enters. We need to boost our predictive power for that crucial E factor.
And given that these major impacts seem to follow that inverse magnitude frequency pattern, like natural disasters.
Yeah, the big ones are rare but catastrophic.
And they're almost always interacting with and often exacerbated by other human-caused stressors. Well, the Ricciardi paper leaves us with a really provocative closing thought for you to consider.
Okay, what is it?
If biological invasions can represent such profound, hard-to-predict, potentially catastrophic risks akin to natural hazards, should we maybe start managing and prioritizing them with the same level of urgency, the same kind of investment that we dedicate to preparing for and responding to things like floods, wildfires, pandemics, or even earthquakes?
Wow. Framing invasions as natural disasters.
Yeah.
That definitely changes the perspective on resource allocation and policy priority.
It certainly opens up a whole new way to think about the scale and urgency of the problem, something for you to mull over.
A profound challenge indeed. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this exploration of the Ricciardi paper has given you a more robust framework for thinking about ecological risk from non-native species.